My name is Cora Hayes. For as long as I can remember, my life has been painted in the quiet, gentle hues of worn book covers and the scent of rain on old paper. I grew up in a small, crooked house where the floorboards sang a soft tune with every footstep, a home filled not with material wealth, but with the boundless riches of stories and art. My father was a furniture maker, a man who believed wood had a soul and that his job was to listen to it. My mother was a potter, her hands perpetually dusted with the fine, gray powder of clay, shaping vessels that were as beautifully imperfect as life itself. They taught me that value wasn't a number printed on a tag, but the love, time, and spirit poured into a thing. It's a philosophy that led me to my calling as the head librarian of a small, struggling community library in the heart of Ethelberg, a city of steel and ambition that often forgot the quiet corners where imagination bloomed. My world, a gentle tapestry of ink and clay, collided with another universe 2 years ago when I met Nathan. Nathan Sterling. He was starlight and ambition, a financial analyst for his father's colossal firm, Vanguard Holdings. He was kind and brilliant, with a smile that could coax the sun from behind the clouds, but he lived in the long, deep shadow of a man he barely knew, his father, Marcus Sterling. Marcus Sterling was less a man and more a myth. A titan of industry who had clawed his way up from nothing to build a global empire, only to vanish from public life a decade ago. He retreated into the forested solitude of his estate in Port Blossom Bay, a coastal enclave of staggering wealth. By all accounts, including Nathan's pained and fragmented stories, he was a man of fierce intellect, biting eccentricity, and impossible standards. He'd famously disowned his eldest son, Nathan's brother, for a perceived slight against the family name. Nathan had spent his entire adult life trying to earn an audience, a nod, a single word of approval from this ghost. And now my turn had come. The invitation, when it arrived, was not written on scented cardstock. It was a digital summons, an email from a law firm with the subject line, regarding a dinner engagement with Mr. Marcus Sterling. The body of the message was as stark and cold as a winter morning. It was a test, Nathan had explained, his face pale, his usual confidence evaporating like mist. "You don't understand, Cora," he'd said, pacing our small apartment, the city lights flickering like anxious stars behind him. "This isn't a friendly meet the parents. My father doesn't do friendly. This is an appraisal. He's going to evaluate you, every word, every gesture. Our future, our wedding, it all hinges on this." The week that followed was a slow-motion descent into a state of anxiety that was entirely foreign to me. Nathan, my rock, became a bundle of nerves, coaching me as if I were preparing for a diplomatic mission. "Don't talk about the library," he'd instructed, his voice tight. "He sees charity work as a sentimental weakness. Don't mention your parents' workshop. He respects commerce, not craft. Stick to neutral ground, art history perhaps. Economics, if you feel confident." He had bought me a dress, a simple sheath of dark navy silk that cost more than my monthly salary, and a scarf, a wisp of seafoam green silk and cashmere that felt like captured air against my skin. He notices details. Appearances matter. And Cora, he had implored, his eyes wide with a desperate fear I'd never seen in him before, "For the love of all that is holy, do not be late." He equates tardiness with a fundamental lack of respect. A character flaw. I felt like a fledgling actress being handed a script I hadn't had time to learn. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on my chest. I wasn't going to meet a future father-in-law. I was going for an audience with an emperor who held our happiness in the palm of his hand. On the morning of the dinner, as I stood before my mirror, the navy dress felt like a costume, the beautiful scarf like a gilded chain around my neck. In my focus on not failing Nathan's test, I had nearly forgotten how to be myself. Nathan had gone ahead to the estate to prepare the ground, leaving me to take the train to Port Blossom Bay. The plan was for me to take a cab from the station. But as I stepped onto the platform in that rarefied air, the overwhelming pressure of the day became suffocating. The station was a little over a mile from the Sterling estate. I looked at my watch. I had enough time. I needed to walk. I needed to feel the earth beneath my feet, to breathe air that wasn't thick with expectation. The walk was a journey into another dimension. The quiet, winding lanes of Port Blossom Bay were lined with mansions that weren't houses but fortresses of privacy, hidden behind towering, perfectly sculpted hedges and gates of wrought iron that looked like they were guarding state secrets. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the sea breeze through ancient cypress trees and the distant, mournful cry of a gull. I, a woman of worn floorboards and dusty shelves, felt like a trespasser in this kingdom of silent, opulent perfection. I checked my watch again. I was cutting it finer than I'd intended, but I still had 20 minutes. I passed a small, manicured green, a perfect emerald square set beside the road. And that's where I saw him. He was the only thing in this entire immaculate town that seemed real, the only element that hadn't been curated and polished to a flawless sheen. He was an old man, sitting on a wrought iron bench, huddled into himself. His clothes were worn and frayed, his face a beautiful, tragic map of a long, hard life. A harsh wind was rolling in from the sea, and he was shivering, his thin jacket a pathetic defense against the damp chill. He looked profoundly lost, achingly hungry, and utterly alone in a world that had forgotten him. My first instinct, the one conditioned by Nathan's panicked instructions, was to look away. Don't get involved. Don't be late. Don't do anything to disrupt the perfect image. But then I saw his eyes. They were a startling, intelligent blue, filled with a deep, quiet weariness that went straight to my heart. And I heard my mother's voice in my memory, her hands covered in clay, her smile gentle. The truest measure of a soul, Cora, is how it behaves when it thinks no one of consequence is watching. To hell with the test. I changed my course, my heels sinking softly into the lush grass as I walked towards the bench. "Excuse me, sir," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Are you all right?" He looked up at me, and there was no suspicion in his gaze, only a deep, abiding tiredness. "Just a bit of a chill, young lady," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "And I seem to have missed the lunch service at the shelter in the next town over." I thought of the simple meal I had packed for the train ride, an apple from our small backyard tree and a piece of bread my father had baked that morning. It was the only food I had. Without a second thought, I opened my bag. "Here," I said, offering it to him. "It's not much, but please take it." He looked from the simple offering to my face, a strange, unreadable expression in his clear blue eyes. He finally took it with a slow, deliberate nod. "Thank you," he murmured. "That is uncommonly kind." As he began to eat, a violent shiver racked his thin frame. On an impulse that felt more natural and right than anything I had done all week, I unwound the expensive, seafoam green scarf from my neck. The one Nathan had insisted I wear. The symbol of my audition. "You need this more than I do," I said, and gently draped the soft, warm fabric over his shoulders. He looked down at the splash of color against his worn jacket, then back up at me. His gaze was so direct, so penetrating, it felt as though he could see the very architecture of my soul. "You are a very kind woman," he said, his voice resonating with a sincerity that warmed me more than the scarf ever could. I just smiled, a genuine smile for the first time that day. I wished him well, and then, glancing at my watch, my heart gave a sickening lurch. I was now, officially and irrevocably, going to be late. I hurried away, a new kind of anxiety churning within me, the fear of Nathan's disappointment. I had failed the test before I had even set foot in the palace. I had no way of knowing that I had just passed the only test that mattered. I left the old man on the park bench, the echo of his quiet gratitude a small, warm ember against the rising storm of my panic. My watch read 5:12 p.m. 12 minutes late. I started to run, my sensible heels digging into the impossibly soft turf that bordered the private lane. The air, which had felt liberating just minutes before, now felt thick and heavy, each breath a struggle. The gates to Greywood Manor were even more formidable up close than I had imagined. They were twin behemoths of black iron, twisted into intricate patterns of leaves and vines, with a severe, stylized S at their heart. I found the intercom panel, a sleek, modern intrusion on the old-world grandeur, and pressed the button. My voice was a thin, trembling thing when I announced myself. Cora Hayes, for Mr. Sterling. There was a long, humming silence that felt like a judgment in itself. Then a low, mechanical buzz, and the massive gates swung inward without a sound, opening a path into another world. The driveway was a winding ribbon of dark, smooth asphalt, carving a path through a private forest of ancient, gnarled oak trees whose branches laced together overhead, creating a dappled, gloomy tunnel. It felt less like an approach to a home and more like a pilgrimage route to a remote, brooding temple. Then, the manor itself came into view at the end of the drive. It wasn't a house, it was a declaration. A sprawling stone edifice of Gothic proportions, with sharp gables, towering chimneys, and dozens of dark, leaded glass windows that seemed to watch my frantic approach like 100 cold, unblinking eyes. And there, at the top of a wide, sweeping stone staircase, pacing under the shadow of an imposing portico, was Nathan. He was not smiling. He was a caged tiger of pure, unadulterated anxiety, his phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip. The moment he saw me, hurrying up the steps, his face, already pale with worry, tightened into a mask of raw, furious disappointment. "Cora, where in God's name have you been?" he hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper as he rushed down to meet me, grabbing my arm. His grip was tight, almost painful. "You are 17 minutes late." 17. I told you how much this meant. This is a catastrophe. A complete and utter catastrophe. "I'm so sorry, Nathan," I said, breathless from my run and from his anger. "I know, I'm so sorry." I was walking from the station, and there was this man on a bench. He looked so cold, and he hadn't eaten, and I had to stop. He stared at me as if I'd just confessed to a capital crime. "A man," he repeated, his voice thick with stunned disbelief. "A homeless man? You were late for a meeting with my reclusive, billionaire father, a meeting that will define the rest of our lives, because you stopped to chat with a homeless man." "I didn't chat," I said, a small flame of defiance flickering to life amidst my guilt. "I gave him my apple. He was hungry, Nathan." It was then that his eyes, scanning my flustered state, fell to my neck. His face, already a mask of fury, seemed to contort even further. "And where," he asked, his voice now dangerously quiet, dangerously calm, "is the scarf? The seafoam green one. The one I bought for you, specifically for this." I couldn't meet his gaze. I looked down at my hands. I gave it to him," I whispered. He was shivering. "You gave it away," he said. The words weren't a question. They were an indictment. His voice rose to a choked, incredulous squeak. "A scarf that cost more than your rent. To a vagrant. Cora, what is wrong with you? Do you have any concept of what is on the line tonight? This isn't a game. This isn't one of your library charity drives. This is my father. He judges everything. The way you look, the way you speak, the way you carry yourself. And you show up late, disheveled, and you've given away the one piece of respectable elegance you were wearing." His words were like a volley of sharp, stinging pebbles. He wasn't just angry. He was terrified. In that moment, stripped of his usual charm and confidence, I saw him for what he was, a frightened little boy, desperate for the approval of a father he idolized and feared in equal measure. And he saw me not as his partner, the woman he loved, but as a fatal liability, of a loose cannon who had just sabotaged his one chance at legitimacy. His cruelty, born of that deep, profound fear, was a terrible thing to witness. The old Cora, the one from a few weeks ago, would have crumbled. But standing there on that imposing stone porch, a strange, quiet calm began to settle in my bones. It was the calm of a choice made and accepted. On that park bench, I had chosen compassion over punctuality. I had chosen human warmth over a silk and cashmere scarf. And if that was the choice that made me unsuitable for the world of Marcus Sterling, then so be it. I had faced a test today, and I knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the stone beneath my feet, that I had not failed. Just then, the massive, carved oak doors of the manor swung open with a soft, expensive sigh. A butler, impossibly tall and thin in a classic black and white uniform, stood framed in the doorway. His face was a study in impassive professionalism. "Mr. Sterling will see you now," he announced, his voice as dry and crisp as an autumn leaf. Nathan immediately straightened his tie, his fear snapping back into place like a rubber band. He grabbed my hand, his palm cold and slick with sweat. "Okay," he whispered, his voice frantic and low. "Okay, just let me do all the talking. Smile. Be polite. Don't mention the man. Don't mention the scarf. Just try not to say anything at all. Please, Cora. Just for tonight. Please, be perfect." He pulled me over the threshold into a cavernous foyer. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of lemon oil and old money. The floor was a dizzying expanse of black and white marble, and our footsteps echoed in the cathedral-like silence. The walls were lined with enormous, dark-hued paintings of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow our progress with silent disapproval. This was not a home. It was a museum, a cold, unloving mausoleum of wealth and power. The butler, who introduced himself as Huxley, led us down a long, silent corridor carpeted in a runner so thick it swallowed all sound. With every step, my heart beat a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. I felt as if I were being led to my own execution. I squeezed Nathan's hand, a gesture meant to reassure him, but it was my own resolve I was shoring up. He was right. This was a test. A test of my breeding, my poise, my worthiness. A test I was certain I had already failed. Huxley stopped before a pair of towering mahogany doors. "Mr. Sterling is waiting for you in the main dining room," he said, and then, with a silent bow, he retreated down the hall, leaving us alone. As we stood there, I could hear a single voice from within the room. A man's voice, low and raspy, with a strange, quiet cadence that tugged at a thread of memory. My heart, which had been pounding, seemed to stop altogether. It couldn't be. Nathan was still whispering panicked instructions, a litany of fear. "Remember, firm handshake, don't." He reached out and pushed open the heavy doors. I wasn't listening to him anymore. I wasn't looking at the magnificent, 20-foot-long dining table, or the glittering, unlit crystal chandelier above it, or the priceless tapestries that adorned the walls. I was frozen, my eyes locked on the single man sitting alone at the far end of the vast table. It was him, the man from the park bench. Huxley, the skeletal butler, had melted back into the shadows of the house, leaving the two heavy mahogany doors slightly ajar. The room they revealed was a cavern of baronial splendor, a space so large and opulent it felt like it belonged in another century. The long, polished table could have seated 30, a gleaming river of dark wood that reflected the gloomy afternoon light from the tall, arched windows. And at the very end of it, in a high-backed chair that resembled a throne, sat the solitary figure of the old man from the park. My mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It was a glitch in reality, a waking dream. "It's a coincidence," a frantic voice in my head insisted. "It's just another old man. You're stressed, you're projecting." But then he moved. He raised a hand, not to his mouth, but to his neck, to adjust something that was draped over the worn, threadbare collar of his jacket. And I saw it. A swathe of soft, unmistakable color against the drab gray fabric. My seafoam green scarf. I stopped dead in the doorway, my feet cemented to the floor. My breath caught in my throat. Nathan, finally sensing my paralysis, stopped his stream of frantic whispers. "Cora? What is it?" "Let's go," he urged, tugging at my arm. And then, he followed my gaze down the immense, intimidating length of the table. He saw his father. The transformation in Nathan was instantaneous and devastating. The man who had just spent 10 minutes berating me for my lack of composure, for my failure to present the right image, now looked like a terrified child who had just seen a ghost. All the color drained from his handsome face, leaving it a waxy, sickly white. His jaw went slack, his confident posture crumbling in on itself. A small, strangled noise, half gasp, half sob, escaped his lips. "Father," he stammered, his voice a disbelieving squeak. What are you wearing? Are you unwell?" The man at the end of the table did not answer his son. He didn't even glance at him. His eyes, those same clear, intelligent blue eyes that had met mine with such quiet dignity on the park bench, were fixed on me. And a slow, warm, and entirely familiar smile spread across his face. "Welcome, Cora," he said, his voice the same kind, raspy whisper I had heard less than an hour before. "Please come in. Take a seat. I must apologize for my earlier state of dress. It's an old, and I'm afraid, rather eccentric habit of mine." I was still rooted to the spot, my mind reeling, trying to stitch together the two impossible images, the shivering, hungry man on the bench and the legendary, reclusive billionaire, Marcus Sterling. They were two separate realities, and my brain could not build a bridge between them. It was Nathan's panicked, horrified whisper that finally broke the spell. "The homeless man," he hissed at me, the words full of a dawning, sickening understanding. That was the homeless man? The full weight of what he had said to me on the porch, his disgust, his condescension, his fury over the scarf, was now crashing down upon him. Marcus Sterling finally turned his cool, discerning gaze upon his son. The warmth vanished from his expression, replaced by an arctic chill that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room. "Nathan," he said, his voice as sharp and brittle as a shard of ice. "You seem surprised. You shouldn't be. You, of all people, should know that I value character above all else. Integrity. Simple human decency. It is the only real currency in this bankrupt world. And I have spent the better part of a decade devising ways to find a trace of it, to see how people behave when they believe no one of consequence is watching." He gestured with a long, elegant hand to the rows of empty, silent chairs lining the vast table. "I have had heirs of powerful families, CEOs of major corporations, and ambitious young men very much like you sit in this room. They arrive in their tailored suits, armed with their perfect manners and their calculated compliments. They perform. My God, how they perform." He sighed, a sound of profound, soul-deep weariness. "But a performance is all it is. An act. A lie." He turned his gaze back to me, and the warmth flooded back into his eyes. It was a look of such genuine, fatherly approval that it made my heart ache. "And then, today," he said, his voice softening again, "this young woman appeared. This young woman, your fiancé, whom you had, quite correctly, filled with dread about this very meeting with the difficult, tyrannical old man of the mountain. This young woman, who was running late, who knew that every second counted, who believed that her appearance and composure were about to be placed under a microscope." He paused, his gaze steady on my face, and it felt as though he were speaking not just to the room, but directly to my soul. "She stopped," he said, the words ringing with the clarity of a bell in the silent room. "She wasn't disgusted. She wasn't afraid. She didn't hurry past with a dismissive glance of pity. She saw a fellow human being in need of warmth, and she did not hesitate." He gestured to a small, fine china plate that now sat beside him on the table. On it was the half-eaten piece of my father's bread. "She gave me her own lunch," he continued, "so that I, a complete and worthless stranger, might not be hungry. And she gave me her own comfort." He reached up and gently, almost reverently, touched the seafoam green scarf still draped around his shoulders, so that I might be warm. He looked from me to his son, his expression now one of severe disappointment. "She failed your shallow, superficial test of punctuality and appearances, Nathan. But she passed mine. The only one that has ever mattered. She passed it with flying, beautiful colors." He then smiled at me again, a smile so full of acceptance and grace it felt like the sun breaking through a month of storm clouds. "Now, Cora," he said, gesturing to the chair directly to his right, the seat of honor. "Let's have some dinner. It appears we have a wedding to plan, and the future of an entire company to discuss." He glanced, almost as an afterthought, at his pale, trembling, and utterly shattered son, who was still standing by the door. "Nathan," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "you may stay and listen. Or you may go. The choice, for once, is entirely yours." The silence that descended upon the grand dining room was a living thing, thick with the weight of Nathan's public humiliation and my own dizzying, surreal shock. Nathan stood frozen by the doors, a ghost at a feast he had orchestrated, his face a canvas of disbelief and shame. He was looking at the man he called father, but seeing a stranger. I, on the other hand, was looking at the man from the park bench and felt, with a sudden and inexplicable clarity, that I knew him completely. With a grace that seemed at odds with his shabby attire, Marcus Sterling gestured again to the seat beside him. "Cora," he repeated, his voice a gentle invitation. "Please." My body, which had felt like stone, finally obeyed. I walked the long, lonely distance along the polished mahogany, the soft click of my heels the only sound in the vast, silent room. It felt like walking through water, a slow-motion dream from which I was sure I would soon wake. I took my seat at the right hand of the strange, unexpected king. After a long, agonizing moment, Nathan finally found the use of his legs. He moved with the shuffling, defeated gait of a disgraced courtier and chose a chair at the farthest, most distant end of the table, isolating himself in his self-imposed exile as far from the center of power as he could possibly get. As if on some invisible signal, Huxley, the butler, re-entered the room, pushing a gleaming silver serving cart. With silent, practiced efficiency, he began to serve the first course of what I knew would be the most excruciatingly awkward dinner of Nathan's life. The conversation, when it began, was not the stilted, formal affair I had been coached for. It was a quiet, intimate dialogue between Marcus and me. Nathan remained a silent, miserable wraith at the other end of the table, staring at his plate, occasionally pushing a piece of exquisitely prepared food around with his fork. Marcus, my eccentric, terrifying, and surprisingly gentle host, ignored him completely. His focus, his entire world, was me. He didn't ask about my family's social standing, my education, or my financial prospects. He asked about me. He asked about the novel I was currently reading, and we spoke for 10 minutes about the beauty of its prose. He asked about my work at the library, the very topic Nathan had forbidden me to mention. My voice, hesitant at first, gained strength and confidence with every sentence. I told him about the children's reading program we had started on a shoestring budget, about the community garden we were trying to plant in the small patch of forgotten land behind the building. He listened with a keen, genuine interest, his head tilted, his intelligent blue eyes never leaving my face. He asked sharp, insightful questions that showed he wasn't just being polite, he was truly engaged. He asked about my childhood, and I found myself telling him about my father's workshop, the scent of sawdust and wood varnish, and my mother's pottery studio, the cool, silken feel of wet clay. I told him about the values they had woven into the fabric of my being, the importance of kindness, the dignity of service, the quiet responsibility we all have to look after one another. He nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. "They sound like good people," he said, his voice soft. "They raised a remarkable daughter." Between the main course and dessert, he reached up and carefully unwrapped the seafoam green scarf from around his neck. He folded it with a surprising tenderness and held it out to me across the table. "I believe this is yours," he said, a twinkle in his eye. I took it from him. The fabric was still warm. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "No, Cora," he replied gently. "Thank you." It was a very great comfort. The entire meal was a quiet, profound, and deeply personal interview. And as we talked, I realized what was happening. He wasn't just getting to know me. He was methodically and devastatingly demonstrating to his son all the qualities he had failed to see in me himself. He was holding up a mirror, showing Nathan that the very things he had urged me to conceal, my humble background, my compassionate nature, my unimpressive job, were the precise qualities his father valued above all else in the world. When the dinner was finally over, Marcus walked with us to the grand foyer. He stopped before the massive oak doors and addressed his son for only the second time that evening. "You have a remarkable woman here, Nathan," he said, his voice quiet but firm, resonating with an authority that allowed for no argument. "Do not make the mistake of underestimating her or her values ever again. Your place in this family and in my company is, for now, secure. Not because of any merit you have displayed tonight, but because of hers." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent hall. Now, go home. And try to be the man she deserves. The car ride back to our small apartment in Ethelberg was conducted in a heavy, suffocating silence. Nathan drove, his eyes fixed on the ribbon of highway unfolding before us, his face a pale, grim mask of shame. I didn't know what to say. There was no victory to celebrate. We had both just been put through the crucible of his father's making, and we were both scorched by it. When we were finally back inside our own living room, a space that suddenly felt like a haven of comforting reality, he broke. He sat on the edge of our worn sofa, buried his face in his hands, and wept. Not with frustration or anger, but with a deep, shuddering shame that was painful to witness. He apologized. Not just for his behavior on the porch, but for the past 2 years. For his fear, for his obsession with his father's approval, forever, even for a moment, trying to shape me into someone I was not. It was the most honest, the most vulnerable, the most real I had ever seen him. And in that moment of his complete brokenness, I knew that our relationship was not over. It was only just beginning. Our wedding, 3 months later, was not the grand society affair Nathan might have once envisioned. It was a small, quiet ceremony in the sun-dappled garden behind my parents' house, surrounded by my father's handcrafted benches and my mother's colorful ceramic pots. Marcus Sterling was there. He wasn't dressed as a man of the streets. He wore a beautifully tailored linen suit, looking every bit the discerning patriarch. But draped around his shoulders, worn not like an accessory but like a medal of honor, was my seafoam green scarf. He was no longer a reclusive billionaire, a terrifying myth. He was just Marcus, my father-in-law, my family. As I stood there, holding Nathan's hand and saying my vows to a man who was now more humble, more thoughtful, and infinitely more deserving of my love, I thought about the nature of tests. I had walked onto that estate terrified of failing a shallow test of appearances and punctuality. I had failed it spectacularly. And in doing so, I had passed the only examination that ever truly mattered. My vindication wasn't in marrying into a fortune or gaining a place in high society. It was in the quiet, simple, and profound realization that true worth is not measured by what you own, or who you know, or how you look. It is measured, always and only, by the kindness you are willing to show to a stranger on a park bench when you believe that no one in the world is watching.